Great. So as mentioned, I am going to record today's session. So if you have folks on your team that weren't able to join, or if there's any information you'd like to come back to, we'll be sure to send this out after the session today. A couple of other additional housekeeping items. If any questions come up throughout the presentation and the materials, there is a Q&A box. Please feel free to drop in your question in there. I will keep an eye on that as I'm going through the materials and would be happy to answer any that come up as we go through. I will also save some time towards the end of the presentation to walk through any questions that we may have missed as we're going through the materials. But with that, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. We're incredibly excited to be chatting about 2025 individual market rate change requests. So, as many of you know, as we think about the ICHRA market and what's been happening over the last, 18 to 24 months, there has been a rising, I would say, delta and difference between group market rates and individual market rates. And so as we head closer to open enrollment, one of the things that we do at LifeRaft is always keep a very close eye on what's happening in the individual market. When thinking about the ICHRA and the possibility for cost savings for any of the groups that you might work with, what rates we're going to be seeing into 2025 is going to play a pretty significant role in whether or not those cost savings are going to persist. And so about I would say 3 to 4 weeks ago, healthcare.gov published all of the requested rate changes that were filed carrier by carrier, state by state. And through that, there's actually some pretty interesting trends and things to keep in mind as you're looking at what open enrollment might actually end up shaping up to be as we get closer to November and December. So what we're going to do today is we're going to spend our time really talking about some of the data and a couple of the interesting things that jumped out to us at LifeRaft as we went through and looked at each of the different requested rate changes. So let's go ahead and jump in. Obviously, rate requests are very carrier and state dependent, right? As all of you know, every single market from a geographic perspective is going to be different. But then also at a carrier level, there are going to be pretty significant differences depending on what kind of realized MLR has looked like over the last year, over the last 2 years for a number of different carriers. When there's obviously higher utilization and MLRs are loss ratios are going up, right? You're going to see carriers actually propose more of a rate change because they're going to need to be able to recoup some of the costs that they're spending on actual medical expenses. So let's start at a very high level, right? When you look at the entire state and every single carrier, when pulling the data, on average at the individual market level, we're seeing just about a 7% rate increase year over year. And so it's a shy under 7%. The number is actually 6.64%. And so that's an interesting kind of benchmark that we can start to use when thinking about whether or not there's going to be ICHRA application for us, broadly speaking, right? As a kind of rule of thumb, what I would say is if there are any groups that you're seeing either in the small group space or the fully insured large group space, again, we're going to want to make sure that we run those numbers kind of on a case-by-case basis. But this gives us a really helpful benchmark to be thinking about. If you're seeing any groups where those rate increases are north of that 7%, it probably is going to make sense for us to take a look at an ICHRA quote for your group. If you're seeing a rate increase that's below 7%, I still think it's worth taking a look at the ICHRA numbers, but it's possible that there's less of a cost savings potential for your groups, right? So the numbers are quite varied, and we're going to talk about a couple of these states on the high end and on the low end, and a couple of other interesting trends that we've seen here. But really, at an average level, we're seeing about a 7% filed rate increase for the year. Now, one thing to always keep in mind here is these are these are filing requests that are filed by the carriers on a state-by-state basis, right? So all the states and the regulators are going through the process of actually reviewing those requests, and we'll get final numbers most likely in the next kind of 3 to 4 weeks, I would think. Some of the states have started releasing those, and some carriers, but we don't have final rates everywhere. But these do serve as a helpful guidepost and benchmark for us as we start to move towards open enrollment. The one thing I'll mention too here is 7% is, I would say, slightly higher than what we've seen on a nationwide basis, kind of year over year compared to the last couple of years. It's possible that that average number comes in below, but we're still seeing the individual market kind of stay within that 5 to 7% year over year increase, which again, as you think about kind of the long-term sustainability of the ICHRA market compared to fully insured group plans, a 5 to 7% year over year increase is one that continues to be sustainable, particularly as you see those groups that have higher utilization and are getting renewal rates that are going to be, can be pretty significant or double digits, as we've seen with a number of groups. So what do these rate changes really mean as we think about 2025, right? As I mentioned, it gives you an early look at potential rate changes in the individual market, but again, really provides you a benchmark for thinking about when is an ICHRA going to be a possibility for certain groups. So the way I would think about this, right, and we're happy to share the data that we pulled this from, is if you're active in a certain state, having a sense of where the individual market's going to land based on where the carriers have filed. If that number is below where your group renewal comes in, I think it's a good idea for you to be looking at an ICHRA. There are a lot of times that an ICHRA can be, I think, helpful and valuable for a number of groups. But if we're thinking about this specifically from a cost savings perspective, then we're really going to want to anchor on, for your state, what's the average year over year increase in the individual market, and what are the renewal rates that my groups are getting from the different carriers, right? What we've seen a lot of over the last year are large groups, particularly large groups, right? So depending on the state, over 50 or over 100, but those groups that aren't community rated, that are getting priced based on utilization, we're seeing a lot of double-digit rate increases again. And there can be a lot of reasons for that, but I think it's incumbent on us as our brokers and benefit consultants, when we're getting a double-digit rate increase or a rate increase that feels that has outpaced your group's kind of average of rate increases year over year when renewals are coming in. I think it's incumbent on us to really start to look at alternative options. And alternative options aren't just, other BUCAs and other carriers. I think it really has to be, how do we look at an ICHRA strategy that could drive real cost savings for an employer like that, that's getting a rate increase, but also giving them potentially a more flexible solution, right? So the ICHRA really becomes a flexible way for your employer groups to be able to reduce and limit, by the way, for future years, healthcare costs that they're seeing, as a replacement for kind of traditional fully insured group health insurance plans. And especially when you see a year where those rates are increasing, right, or changing widely, the ICHRA could again further drive additional value there. So if we kind of look at the map, right, compared to the national average, the national average is sitting at about 6.64%. Where is there going to be opportunity? Where are we seeing lower than average renewal rates and requests for increases? And where are we seeing higher than average? A lot of this map looks pretty similar and I think pretty spot on to what we might consider, right? The certain states where we're seeing higher than average are places like Oregon, Washington, California, New York, up into the Northeast, right? These are states where generally we have seen renewals come in, right? Whether it's your group renewal or whether it's for the individual market, but specifically individual market, we've really seen those markets come in with renewal requests and increase requests that have come in above the national average. And that's no surprise, right? Either for regulatory purposes, the cost of administering health plans, or because of utilization, depending on population, we're seeing a lot of those similar states that are coming in with higher than national average requests. So again, we're going to share this information. We're going to share the deck with everybody. But this, I think, really becomes a helpful guidepost. If you know you're in Texas, for example, that means the average renewal request came in below 7%. Texas might be an interesting place to start looking, right? Texas in general, there's two pieces of data here to layer on, right? There's what is everybody requested, and then there's another map that we don't have in this presentation, but we have looked at previously and talked a lot about, which is, in on a county by county basis, in which states is the individual market cheaper than the small group. And so that's a really key point that I think this year may start to really transition, where a place like Texas in the past, the individual market has actually been slightly more expensive than the small group market. And when you have the carriers in Texas filing for a lower than 7% average increase on the individual market, depending on what happens with the small group market, although it's likely that's going to come up more than the individual market, based on what we understand about the size of the population and the dynamics of the pricing, we might start to see some of these states shift and have new opportunities for ICHRA where they may not have been as attractive for your employers in the past. So this is something really to keep your eye on. Certain states that I think we're going to start to see shifting this year as we look at pricing dynamics and the implication for ICHRA suitability for certain small groups and large groups that you have in these states. So let's look at a couple of states that I thought were interesting for us to call out here. Generally what you're seeing is carriers are requesting rate increases year over year, but there have been a certain few states and carriers where we've actually seen the carriers looking at requested rate changes that are actually lower than last year. And so if you're in a place like Alabama, right? Alabama, we have some groups that are in Alabama, but it hasn't been a particularly strong ICHRA environment. If you're based in Alabama or you have groups that are based in Alabama, I think this rate change might be a really interesting one. As we start to see, BCBS and United Healthcare in Alabama start to request reductions in their rates. Again, you might see this dynamic of the ICHRA versus the group market really start to shift. And so looking at an ICHRA in the state of Alabama could become really, really interesting. I want to mention, right, when evaluating an ICHRA, there's a number of kind of factors that we want to look at, particularly as it relates to the individual market. An ICHRA, number one of those considerations is price, and that's what we're focused on here. The second thing that you're going to want to think about is the depth of the individual market, right? And when I say depth, I'm thinking the number of carriers that are available, the types of plans, and the variety of plans that are available. So different metal tiers, configurations. And so price is always going to be an important factor in evaluating whether or not ICHRA is a right fit for your groups. But the other thing you're always going to want to think about is, how many carriers are available in the individual market, and is there enough coverage from a plan variability perspective to really meet the needs of my employer groups? So that is something that we at LifeRaft obviously help with. But this is a really interesting thing to keep in mind. So if you have any business in Alabama, or thinking about Alabama, the fact that the carriers are looking at a reduction in premium rates, again, could make the ICHRA a really, really interesting option there. Let's look at a couple of other, right? Iowa is another one. Iowa's an interesting state. Iowa's always been particularly, I would say, carrier and insurance friendly, right? From a regulatory perspective, the three big carriers there, we see one of them kind of requesting an increase in their rates, but Oscar and Medica, we're seeing actually reductions in the rates there. And so again, when you're seeing these states where carriers are coming in and they're requesting reductions in rates, that could become a really, really interesting place for your employer groups. Louisiana is another one. Louisiana is an interesting market because they actually have a number of, I would say, they have a few kind of uh, uh, local carriers, and then they have obviously AM Better and United Healthcare are also available in Louisiana. AM Better, I think what we've seen from their utilization is they can actually support a bit of a pretty sizable reduction in their rates here. And so again, if you have clients in Louisiana or thinking about Louisiana, it could be a really interesting place for your customers. And with AM Better, plane selection and availability in Louisiana is pretty rich, right? So if we're starting to see a compression on premiums, I think AM Better is really looking to try to gain market share in Louisiana, which again, for us as brokers and consultants and folks that are advising on benefit selection, that could become a really interesting opportunity for you when talking to your clients and your groups that are focused are based in Louisiana. Now, um, those are the states where we've seen them come in pretty significantly um, below the national average. Let's talk about a couple of states where we've seen them come in. I think this one is not going to surprise anybody. New York State. New York State has always been pretty expensive. And when looking at everything that's been filed there, on average, we're looking at about a 25% increase. Um, with New York in general, I think this is a question that we get often, and I like to be very transparent about it. New York State for the ICHRA market is a really, really challenging environment. I think there are very specific instances in which an ICHRA or a QSARA in New York State, New York City specifically, could make sense. And that's really when you have groups that are distributed, right? So there's some people that are based in New York. There's a number of employees that are based outside of New York. I think in instances like those, an ICHRA or a QSARA could be valuable to your clients. But New York is really not going to be driving a number cost savings for most groups. When looking at groups that can meet minimums for a small group or be a part of a PEO, frankly, those have often been more cost-effective solutions for groups that are domiciled in New York State when compared to an ICHRA or QSARA. And I think that's really for two reasons, right? Number one, obviously, there's a lot of cost pressure in the individual market there. But I think the other thing is when looking at the quality of actual coverage and plans that are available through the carriers, we found that most employees aren't very happy with the deductibles or the out-of-pocket maximums or even the networks that are available. And so that's something just to keep in mind here when looking at this. The big ones to kind of keep an eye on here, I think, are obviously UHC and also Oscar. Obviously, Oscar is domiciled in New York, but when you're seeing pretty significant, 20 to 30% rate increases, I think that cost pressure is going to continue into 2025, making New York a pretty difficult and inhospitable environment for ICHRAs and QSARAs. The other two, Alaska, again, not a huge surprise with Alaska. Population that's covered there is very, very small. There are not that many carriers that are available there. And so there's been a pretty sizable increase in Alaska. We don't have a ton of producers that work in Alaska, but if you have groups in Alaska, I'm not sure what the group market dynamics are in Alaska, but I would think that there's going to be pretty sustained cost pressure across the board, given the population and just the general size of Alaska. The other one we're seeing here is Vermont, and again, that's not a huge surprise here. When you have states with lower populations, you're going to see increased rate changes, both in the individual market, but you're also probably going to see them across the board. So Vermont, Alaska, New York, those are ones where, I think the dynamics of the ICHRA from a cost perspective are not going to be the most interesting. That being said, it doesn't mean that an ICHRA or QSARA isn't going to be an interesting option for your employer groups there. It's just not going to be driven by cost primarily, like we might see in some of the other states that we've talked about. Another state, we've talked about this a few times, but one thing to keep in mind here across the board is as we moved into 2024, the Indiana state legislature passed a tax incentive for Indiana groups that were looking at implementing an ICHRA. And it really provided a $400 per year tax credit per employee that was covered for the first year, and then 200 for subsequent years. If we look at kind of what's been happening in Indiana, rate increases, Indiana, I believe, came in below the national average, right? So you're seeing the individual market pricing continue to be attractive there, coupled with this tax credit. It's going to be a really interesting, I think, uh, uh, example for other lawmakers out there. And if Indiana is successful and we see broad adoption of the ICHRA in Indiana, I think as we move into 2025, it would not surprise me if we start to see other states incentivizing small groups and larger groups to really start to transition to the ICHRA with additional tax incentives, as we've seen. Through the year, I think, the jury is still out in Indiana. We haven't seen a huge uptake in Indiana for ICHRA with the tax incentive. That could be potentially from a education and marketing perspective. It may take a couple of years to see if adoption and uptake in the ICHRA market is really there. But again, this is going to be an interesting one for us to keep our eye on as we move into 2025, particularly open enrollment, when groups are starting to make their renewal decisions, and as we get close to that time period, keeping an eye on Indiana is going to be important. Um, a couple of things are just about, HRA market and ICHRA in general. We've all seen these numbers, right? ICHRA and HRA is increasingly growing in popularity with groups across the spectrum. We're seeing a number of ALEs really start to adopt. From 2022 to 2023, that number is pretty significant. What we've seen, and I know other HRA providers have also kind of put out there publicly, is 2024 into 2025 really seems to be potentially the inflection point of more a broader adoption of the ICHRA. We've seen more distribution partners like brokers, PEOs, really start to be interested in finding an ICHRA solution and partner that they can utilize as we move into open enrollment. But you're also starting to see more groups proactively ask about the HRA and the ICHRA, right? And so I think if we look at what's happening from a rate perspective, if those numbers hold and we see renewals that come in pretty similar in the small and large group market compared to last year, the calculus for the ICHRA and the adoption really should grow even more than it did from 22 to 23. And so this open enrollment, I think, is going to be a really important and a busy one in the HRA market as we look at everything that's happening within that market, right? From our perspective, I think we still believe that the full potential of the HRA market hasn't been met. And I think as groups start to increasingly entertain the idea of transitioning to an HRA, it's incumbent on the carriers, it's incumbent on the HRA providers like ourselves to be able to really push the technology so that the experience of offering an HRA or an ICHRA is really on par with the group market. When we think about cost dynamics, right? If you can, as a group broker or a consultant or somebody that's really a trusted fiduciary when making a benefits decision, show your clients that they're able to save, on average $250 per employee per month by transitioning to an ICHRA. The single biggest, I think, challenge after that is going to be change management, right? So change management from transitioning from a fully insured group plan to an ICHRA, the process is different today. Really working with your employer and your employee groups and helping them understand the product and the transition from those, how the experience might be different, that's going to be really important, right? If the numbers hold the way that we've seen and these rate increases hold, that to me means the value proposition for the ICHRA is going to continue to be really, really clear to our employer groups. And so when offering and talking to them about the ICHRA, where you are really going to be able to drive value is assisting them through the change management and transitioning their group from the fully insured group space into the ICHRA market. You know, again, what we've seen, right, when thinking about this from a PEO or a group broker's perspective is if group market rates outpace the individual market, which they likely will on on an average basis, but also a case by case basis, that's going to create real cost pressure. And so we need to be looking at as trusted advisors to our clients, we need to be looking at these alternative solutions. I think then, leaning into the flexibility of the ICHRA is really going to be something for you all to be able to help sell these as better solutions for your groups that are facing specific challenges. And I've talked about this, right? But the need for enhanced tools, and that's our focus at LifeRaft is how do we build a better system for you all so that you're able to seamlessly transition and provide your customers an experience of offering the ICHRA that's on par with what they have today through the group health space. Um, what are some of the challenges as we head into 2025, right? As we head into open enrollment, there are still some challenges when we think about implementation of ICHRAs and HRAs, right? Health insurance enrollment and endless selections are a real challenge. This is one of the things we've heard from folks um, time and time again, which is how are my employees going to know what plans to select and how they're going to select them? And so that's really where we as a platform can be of assistance, but also for you all that actually handle individual enrollments, this is an opportunity for you to, I think, really further drive value for your customer base where you're able to help your employees or the employer's employees really evaluate and select plans that are going to cater to their individual needs, right? I think another thing to keep in mind here is specialty HRAs, right? We do a lot of specialty HRAs at LifeRaft. Not all platforms do, but we've seen a growing trend of groups that are looking to cover specific expenses that may not be covered with their group health insurance today. And this really can be, I think, a powerful way to, again, help your clients solve a really unique challenge and to drive additional value, right? Whether it's fertility coverage, whether it's prescription medication coverage, whether it's mental health coverage, we're seeing a growing number of employers look at implementing specialty HRAs for these very specific use cases. And again, we're going to have to see what these final rate increases come out to. But for 2025, it looks like excuse me, the dynamics between the individual market and the group market are going to hold. But that's something that we're going to have to continue to revisit year over year as we think about the ICHRA and the HRA market. Great. So I'm actually going to stop there. We had about 30 minutes. There's a couple of kind of basic information in terms of types of HRA accounts that we won't cover today. But with that, I just want to pause in the event there are any questions that come up. Um, uh, and yeah, I appreciate everybody taking the time. I'll pause here. I'm going to stick around for any questions. And as I mentioned, we will be sending along the recording to everybody. And then I would encourage you to look at the data that comes out from healthcare.gov on your specific state to see what the final numbers look like. But again, big picture, we're I think seeing a continued difference between the individual market rates and the group market rates, which again should bolster ICHRA adoption as we move into open enrollment for 2024. Any questions? Great. Well, thanks everybody. Really appreciate you taking the time. I'm going to go ahead and stop the